Thanks. Okay. So this whole session is about syntax and its neural basis. And my part of it is to review studies of abnormalities of syntactic processing in patients and the neural correlates of those abnormalities. The talk has the following structure. I'll take my watch off, but don't feel as much pressure. I just can't talk with a watch on. So it feels much pressure for time here. I'm going to go through this material kind of in two passes. One is a description of very early psycholinguistic studies and what I think they led to, and a series of studies of deficit lesion correlations that are based on end-of-sentence measures of the ability to assign syntactic structure and use it to determine what a sentence means. And then a second pass where I look at deficit lesion correlations where the measure of a syntactic comprehension problem is some online measure. And then a lot of the talk is going to then turn away from pathology altogether and talk about deficits and look at two, or depending on how the time goes, three different hypotheses about what abnormalities might be leading to poor performance on tests that require syntactic comprehension. Okay, well, I mean, you all, I think, were here this morning, so and you all know what syntax is, so I'm going to skip that and start at the beginning, which is Karamatsa and Zurif, 1976. And what they showed was that there were a small number of aphasic patients, 4 agrammatic aphasic patients and 4 what they call transmotor aphasic patients in the terminology of the day, who had the following pattern of performance. When they were asked to match spoken sentences to pictures, they had no trouble with sentences like, the apple the girl ate was red. And they had no trouble with the boy chased the girl. But they were at chance on understanding sentences like, the boy the girl chased fell down. And what they said was that these patients had lost what they called algorithmic processes for understanding a sentence, which were required in the first sentence on that list. But they retained what they called heuristic processes. Now, heuristic processes referred to the ability to put the words of a sentence together to form a coherent, plausible proposition, so something you might call pragmatically based combinatorial interpretation, and also the ability to assign thematic roles based upon some very simple structural features like the linear order of words. So that's why they could understand sentences like the third sentence, where the pragmatic combinatorial mechanism would yield either of two interpretations that are plausible. But the first type of sentence, you can't get the syntactically licensed interpretation in either of those ways, because either boys and girls can chase each other and both can fall down, and a strictly linear order of words would lead to a rather confusing assignment of thematic roles, certainly not necessarily a unique one, although possibly a unique one within each patient. What they meant by the algorithmic processes that were abnormal, affected in these patients, were basically the application of parsing and interpretation rules. Now this paper, in my opinion, was important for 3 reasons. The first is that it was the first demonstration of a disorder of comprehension of language that was not lexical. It showed that people could have trouble understanding sentences that depended upon their syntactic structure to be understood. The second is that it was the first paper that showed or argued that comprehension deficits could arise from lesions anterior to the central sulcus, because the dominant theories at the time all said that comprehension went on in the superior temporal gyrus, or perhaps the supramarginal and angular gyri in inferior parietal lobe, and there were very good theoretical reasons, people thought, for saying that comprehension should go on in those areas. And the third reason that the paper was important is that it suggested that what was localized wasn't an entire faculty like the ability to understand, but rather an aspect of grammar, that is, a type of representation. And the reason that it made that argument was that Alfonso and Edgar emphasized the fact that these patients were agrammatic, or had Broca's aphasia in production, therefore had a problem in the production of syntactic structure that they said paralleled their problem in comprehending sentences that required syntactic structure. And what was lost was, in Edgar's phrase, an overarching ability that basically consisted of representations of syntactic structure. So, now, that conclusion and all conclusions about the localization of components of the language processing system based upon deficit lesion analysis requires a deficit analysis. This enterprise is not in the business of localizing symptoms. That's of interest neurologically. It used to be of more interest. Now we have a much better idea of where lesions are by imaging people than by inferring where the lesions are from their physical examination. But for a century, localization of symptoms played a very important role in determining the location of neurological disease, and that helps establish its etiology. But that's a different enterprise. It's related, but a different enterprise than localizing functions based upon the analysis of patients. In order to localize a function, you have to you have to analyze the behavior as the result of the normal system minus some component or operation that is deficient, plus the addition of any strategic mechanisms that might be relevant to performing the task. So the deficit is inferred, as I said here, from analysis behavior, which is partly a logical analysis. What would the system do without that function? And what do compensatory mechanisms achieve? This increasingly is being modeled in implemented simulations. If you can identify the deficit, or to the extent that whatever deficit you identify, however justifiable your deficit analysis is, the logic of deficit lesion correlations for the neural basis of the functions that are deficient is that the area, or let us say the neural elements that are lesions, that is, that are not operating properly, are necessary for the operation of the function that is deficient. And I'm just going to squeeze in a little comment about what the logic of activation studies using fMRI is. That is that the areas that are activated in a study are jointly sufficient for the exercise of the function that is being imaged. They're not necessary. We can't conclude that they're necessary, and we can't conclude that they're individually sufficient. They're jointly sufficient. Anyway, that will pertain to the other talks. Okay, so a conclusion that people came to, based on that one paper, was that Broca's area, the area in which a lesion produces Broca's aphasia, is necessary for syntactic operations in both production and comprehension. And in some versions of this theory, it was necessary for the representation of syntax. Now, much more specific claims have been made about the deficits that are seen in patients with Broca's aphasia or agrammatism, or sometimes lesions in Broca's area or in related areas. And all of you, I expect, know at least some of them. So probably the most well-known one is Joseph Brzezinski's view that the deficit in these patients is not general, but restricted to the ability to co-index the traces that are postulated in Chomsky's theories of syntax. Okay. What's the legacy of this early work? Well, in my view, the biggest legacy is methodological. It has to do with the criteria for identifying a deficit in syntactically based comprehension. So this, to identify a deficit, I think what has emerged beginning from 1976 is that a deficit in syntactic comprehension can be diagnosed when you see poor performance on an experimental sentence that has a particular element, syntactic element, or that requires a particular syntactic operation, and good performance on a baseline sentences that has or requires everything except this element and this operation. I know all early studies judge good and poor performance based on accuracy, and I'm going to have a lot more to say later about what constitutes good and poor performance. But we'll just sort of let it go at that for the moment. In the early literature, the common sentence types that were used were experimental sentences like passives compared to baseline sentences like actives, and experimental sentences like various object-extracted clauses, relative clauses with object extraction, clefs with object extraction, again, subject-extracted sentences with the same, call it context. And these baseline sentences were thought to control for short-term memory demands made by the experimental sentences. The fact that they were being matched to pictures, or in some cases, like my work, enacted, was thought to control performance on the baseline experimental task for the sentence type, I should say, for the demands of the task. The fact that the vocabulary was the same was thought to control for vocabulary knowledge. In this early work, the very early work, there were really no images of brain, or perhaps a single slice through a CT scan. And lesions were thought to be related to syndromes like Broca's aphasia, and agrammatism were thought to require lesions in Broca's area. This turned out to be problematic. J. Moore in '76 showed that permanent Broca's aphasia required lesions that extended well beyond Broca's area. And Marie Vanier and I were asked to analyze brains of people in an interdisciplinary program on agrammatism that was published by Harold Goodglass and several other people in 1980. And we analyzed 18 brains of people who, it was a cross-language study. And these were the prototypical agrammatic patients of these researchers in their language. And there was a huge variety in lesions, including one that only affected the temporal lobe. In patients who were considered to be the prototype for agrammatic patients in their language. But eventually, lesions became determined by the analysis of radiological data, CT scans and MR scans. So if you look at studies that meet the criteria that a deficit is established by contrasting performance on a semantically reversible experimental sentence with performance on a semantically reversible baseline sentence that is plausibly controlling for factors like short-term memory, vocabulary, and we're always talking about the same task, and that lesions were analyzed by analysis of actual radiological images at multiple levels of the brain, then there's only a few studies that actually provide data that are relevant to the relationship between lesions and deficits in syntactic comprehension, and as far as I know, I've listed them all here. And I'm just going to mention that several well-known and frequently mentioned studies don't meet these criteria. So, for instance, there's a paper by Dronkers and another by Amici in 2007 that use reasonably sophisticated analysis. Actually, they're not even that sophisticated analysis of lesions, but anyway, analyses of lesions, but use the cycle as the measure of syntactic comprehension. 1/3 of the trials on the cycle have lexical foils, not syntactic foils, and so errors could have consisted of picking the wrong an item that designates the wrong lexical item. Those errors were not segregated out of the performance. We have no way of knowing. I mean, Nina knows, but she's not telling how many errors were of that sort. And so those papers don't meet criteria. If you want me to talk about those papers, I can talk about them a lot later. I'm not going to now. Okay, I'm going to talk about all of these papers except two which introduce the notion of task effects, which I'm going to leave for later. Okay, so I'm going to briefly run through them. I'm going at a very leisurely pace, so it might actually take up almost 2 hours if you can stand it. All right, our 1996 paper, we studied 18 people with aphasia. We looked at 5 regions of interest. We had 25 sentence types, which is a lot, and 12 examples of each sentence type, which is a fair number. We looked at a wide variety of syntactic structures, so referentially dependent noun phrases, pronouns and reflexives, and phonologically empty noun phrases, pro, NP trace, and WH trace. And we found nothing. We found no significant correlations of lesion size in normalized volumes of the entire language zone in any of these 5 ROIs, in normalized lesion volume in the anterior or posterior perisylvian ROIs, with any of the measures of syntactic comprehension that we looked at. We looked at 19. These results were unchanged when we regressed out effective total lesion volume and then did correlations with the residuals of that regression. We also looked at every case individually, so we looked at patients with very small lesions, and performance was not related to the location of those lesions. And we also looked at patients who performed within a particular range of syntactic comprehension, and their lesions were all over the place. So, no correlations whatsoever. Warren, in 2009, looked at 24 patients with aphasia, people with aphasia, and 11 controls. They used something called the aphasia comprehension test, comprehensive test of aphasia is David Howard's, and a test for the reception of grammar. They found, and they looked particularly for the strength of connectivity between the left and right superior temporal gyrus. They found that connectivity strength, so that's a point in passing, is that lesion location is not the only neural element or neural feature that one might be interested in correlating with syntactic comprehension or anything else. It just happens to be the one that most people have used, and it's obviously relevant. So they found that there was a significant relationship in connection strength and spoken word and sentence comprehension, but not performance on the TROG, which is the test of syntactic comprehension. So there was no effect in this study of the neural parameter that they measured on syntactic comprehension either. Tyler and her colleagues in 2011 studied 14 patients, did a voxel-based lesion symptom mapping analysis with MR studies. They studied actives versus passives, and they found that damage in multiple areas, the left inferior frontal gyrus, the middle temporal gyrus, the superior temporal gyrus, and supramarginal gyrus, correlated with syntactic errors in passives but not in actives. They also looked for the correlation of lesions in these perisylvian ROIs with a syntactic acceptability judgment for ambiguous and unambiguous sentences. So these were garden path sentences. I think that they were reduced relative clauses, but actually at the moment I can't remember. And they found that damage in the left middle temporal gyrus and inferior frontal gyrus was associated with smaller differences in error rates in ambiguous compared to unambiguous sentences in people with aphasia. That seems counterintuitive. One would expect that since the ambiguous sentences are harder, that if these areas were responsible for the syntactic operations that led to their interpretation, that larger lesions would produce more errors and a larger difference between unambiguous and ambiguous sentences. But these authors had an explanation for their finding that ran as follows. The error rates in controls were extremely high for the ambiguous sentences that were disambiguated towards less preferred interpretations. They said normal individuals were highly sensitive to the preferred interpretation of the ambiguous segment. That is how the normal sentence comprehension process works. And so a smaller difference between error rates in ambiguous and unambiguous sentences in people with aphasia indicates less normal sensitivity to syntactic structure and its interpretation. That strikes me as just irrelevant. And in fact, people with aphasia did better than the controls on the ambiguous sentences. So that aspect of the study I don't think we can make much sense of. Thought Theory and her colleagues looked at a much larger number of patients, 79, and used sentence picture matching, but only used 5 examples of each sentence type. They looked at 3 baseline sentences, actives with prepositional phrases, locatives, and subject relative clauses. I guess there are 4 sentences there, sorry about that. And 2 experimental sentences, passives and object relative clauses. They did a voxel-based lesion symptom mapping analysis and found that, so this is a whole brain analysis, not pre-selected ROIs, and they found that the lesions in the size of lesions in temporal parietal cortex correlated significantly negatively with baseline and experimental sentences. So again, no evidence for a syntactic comprehension deficit based upon that result, right? Because no differential correlation with experimental than baseline sentences, but that the regional analysis showed that the difference score was significantly correlated with damage in one part of the inferior parietal lobe. There are lots of limitations of these studies. There's small numbers of patients in some of them. There are small numbers of sentence types or examples. The results are inconsistent across these studies. That, as far as I can tell, is the sum total of the database that is available based on chronic stroke. Acute stroke is it uses a somewhat different technique. I'm going to say this was pioneered by R.J. Hillis, certainly an early contributor. What people do is they look at areas of hypoperfusion that then regain their perfusion either as a result of the natural history of the stroke or because of efforts to increase blood pressure and sometimes anticoagulation. This can happen in minutes, and people's functional abilities can change as a function of the area that is perfused, not infarcted. So Davis looked at one patient, found that there was hypoperfusion 85% of Brodmann area 45 and 47% of 44. That resolved over 36 hours, so naturally. This patient was at chance on semantically reversible yes-no questions and matching semantically reversible active and passive sentences to video, so had a major problem with reversible sentences. Doesn't meet criteria for a deficit analysis that clearly shows that the problem lies in syntactic comprehension because there's no difference between the baseline and experimental sentences. Second study that I'm going to review is, wait a minute, where am I here? This is, oh, there we go, is 3940 were also associated with word comprehension deficits. So again, essentially a null result with respect to syntactic comprehension. Magnus' daughter and colleagues looked at 50 people with aphasia within 20 days of an infarction. They used 9 sentence types with 5 examples. They did a voxel lesion-based symptom correlation, and they found that overall performance was predicted by lesions in the middle temporal gyrus, the superior temporal gyrus, the inferior parietal lobe, the angular gyrus, the occipital cortex, the fusiform, the medial temporal structure. Canonical sentences were mostly affected by lesions in the superior and posterior portions of this area, and non-canonical sentences in the inferior and anterior portion of this area, and lesions in the anterior, superior, and middle temporal gyri and temporal lobe predicted the difference between performance on canonical and non-canonical sentences. These studies also generally tend to have small numbers of sentences, and the results are inconsistent. Okay, turning to second set of data. Am I paralyzing you, or is this okay? I mean, it's just a lot of data. I didn't feel right just summarizing it. I thought I would at least show you a slide about each of these studies. It's not that many. Deficit lesion correlations based on online measures. So there are 3 studies. First is a study that we published in 2007 where we did self-paced listening in 2 tasks, sentence picture matching and grammaticality judgment. I'll come back to task effects later, it's going to be a big theme. And we found no effects of lesions on any online measures. The online measures are corrected self-paced, there are a number of them, but the ones we used in this study were corrected self-paced listening times at the verb, at critical points in the experimental sentences. So for instance, would be the verb of the relative clause of an object extracted sentence, and the corresponding points in the baseline sentence we would use 2 contrasts. One would be the verb of the relative clause of a subject extracted sentence, which doesn't share the same position. In particular, it's not phrase final, but it shares category. And the object noun of the relative clause of the subject extracted sentence, which in English shares the position of being phrase final but doesn't share category. And we would, when I say corrected listening time, I mean that we subtract the duration of the segment from the listening time to do something that is something like regressing word length against a response, and we regress frequency against that residual in order to eliminate facts about frequency, unless the words are the same. So if the words are the same and the same frequency, you don't have to bother with that second regression, and sometimes we do and sometimes we don't, but when they're different, like nouns versus verbs, then we regress on frequency. So anyway, we didn't find any effects of lesion size in any of the ROIs that we measured, which were perisylvian, anterior, inferior temporal, and superior parietal, which were the areas that anyone up to that point had suggested might be involved in syntactically based comprehension. Tyler studied 14 patients with aphasia on a word monitoring task where people have to identify a word in a stimulus. The stimulus is either a normal sentence, anomalous prose, or a random word string. The measure of syntactic processing is the distance effect in anomalous prose. So as you go through a real sentence or a sentence with anomalous anomalous prose, you get better at predicting upcoming items in a real sentence, both syntactically and semantically, and anomalous prose syntactically, and your ability to monitor, to identify that a target has shown up gets faster. So the purest effect, they say, is the distance effect in anomalous prose, where there's no semantic influence on the prediction of the upcoming items. They found that a position effect in normal sentences in the people with aphasia, not in the anomalous prose. And they found a position effect in both anomalous prose and real sentences in controls. There was a negative correlation between lesion size and in two parts of Broca's area and the position effect in anomalous prose in the patients. And they said that increasing damage in these two areas is associated with impaired syntactic processing. There are a number of questions about this study. They didn't report error rates, so the RTs to words early and late might reflect speed accuracy trade-offs. A larger difference score or a smaller difference score could be due to many combinations of slower and faster RTs for early and late targets. This is a general problem with difference scores. The absence of a correlation between lesion size in these areas and the position effect in normal sentences is puzzling, partly because these patients did show a position effect in normal sentences and not in the anomalous prose where the correlation was found. And secondly, the syntactic processing that produces the position effect in anomalous prose contributes to the position effect in normal sentences. So sort of would have expected it there, but they didn't find it. The last study I'm going to review here is a study that is now accepted, and it's not out yet, in which we looked at 11 different sentence types. We divided them up into the four groups that you see at the bottom: passives versus actives, object-extracted relatives versus subject-extracted relatives, sentences with pronouns against sentences with a third noun phrase, sentences with reflexives against sentences with a third noun phrase. And in the second, third, and fourth groups, there are multiple structures that each instantiate that contrast. The underlined words here are considered to be the critical words in the experimental sentences, and then the underlined words in the baseline sentences are the corresponding words in the baseline sentences. Okay, and we regressed total lesion volume, time since stroke, self-paced listening time at the equivalent word in the baseline sentence, and 10 measures of working memory. As a group, the sum total of performance on 10 measures of working memory that I can talk to you about later if you want. And then lesion volume in each ROI or parcellation unit in the Rademacher parcellation unit analysis of brain against the self-paced listening time for the critical word in the baseline sentence. And since the critical words are the same as the equivalent words, length, frequency is not an issue here. I should say, I'm always talking about here corrected listening times. What we found was that lesions in the posterior supramarginal gyrus produced longer self-paced listening times in reflexives, and lesions in the middle frontal gyrus and in the orbital frontal gyrus produced shorter self-paced listening time in reflexives in the one case and in pronouns in another. I can talk to you about excessively short listening times in self-paced listening later, but I will just point out that you can get pathologically reduced self-paced listening times associated with abnormally high error rates, and I think that that's a control problem where people truncate the processing of the sentence at that point for some reason, probably having to do with the short-term memory demands of the self-paced listening task, and they make a poor choice, and then they wind up not understanding the sentence. Anyway. So there are very few online studies, there are very few effects. There's no overlap of areas that have been related to pathological online performances across these studies. Okay, so not a picture that converges. I don't know why this picture doesn't converge. It might be that we're just measuring the wrong thing neurologically. It might be that the studies don't have enough power. It might be that we're not measuring syntactic comprehension properly. I think we have a long way to go. But what I'm myself particularly interested in, what I'm going to talk to you about for as long as you'll let me, is where we might do better in analyzing deficits. So I am going to now present three views of what psychological problems might be causing abnormal performance in these syntactically based comprehension tests that differ from the analyses that have been standard. And I think that many people, including I suspect many people in this room, think are right, which is that people who perform poorly on reversible experimental sentences and well on reversible baseline sentences, as measured by accuracy, perhaps by some online measure, have a problem in using a particular syntactic operation, namely the one that's present in the experimental sentence and not present in the baseline sentence. I'm going to present three alternatives to that view. Well, I thought originally I was going to present three, then I thought I'd present two for reasons of time. Now I think maybe I'll present three, but you can tell you've had enough after two. Okay. I'm going to argue that there is, I was going to say accumulating evidence, getting to be quite good evidence that the deficits that produce these syntactic impairments do not reside in the parser interpreter at all, but they reside elsewhere. Two of these deficits suggest that they reside in control operations. Two of these deficit analyses suggest that they reside in control operations, and the third in something that I'm going to call resource allocation, or resource availability, which I don't quite conceive of as a control operation. Okay, so the first line of evidence has to do with task effects, which I mentioned earlier and I mentioned yesterday. If you go back 20, 30 years, well, 20, I guess, there has been some evidence that the same aphasic patient can perform differently on two tasks when presented with a semantically reversible sentence of a particular type. So, why did I leave out, now I've forgotten their names, this Australian group. I think it's because, well, I don't know, I left them out for reasons of time. But there were two patients that were described by, help me, anyway, someone or other and someone else in Australia, I'll come back in a minute, who did well in enacting the meaning of reversible passive sentences and poorly on matching reversible passive sentences to pictures. In 1997, we looked at 17 people with aphasia and gave them the same sentences on a sentence-picture matching and an enactment task, and we found correlations of about 0.6 for 11 sentence types on these two tasks. So that's a significant correlation, but it only accounts for 36% of the variance. It leaves lots of room for people to performing better on one task than another on the same sentence type. In 2010 and 2011, my colleagues and I, Roy Gutman, did a complicated set of Roche models of sentence picture matching and enactment data that we had with 11 sentence types, with 10 examples of each sentence type. In a Roche model predicts performance on a sentence type by the demands made by each sentence and the capacity of each patient, and you can test models that assign demand separately to sentences in different tasks and sentences of different types. So we did all of that, and then you can compare the goodness of fit of the resulting models by using the AIC and BIC criteria and a bunch of other criteria, and what we found was that models that involve task effects, this has a task effect and this has a task effect, were always the best fitting models. So that argues that the demand made by sentences differs as a function of the tasks that they are in. Now we became interested in the frequency with which you ever saw the same deficit in the same sentence in one aphasic individual across different tasks. And we have now published data on over 100 patients, either testing them on two tasks, object manipulation and self-paced reading, and self-paced sentence picture matching, or sentence picture matching with whole sentence presentation uninterrupted, or sentence picture matching with auditory moving windows, self-paced listening presentation where they ask for each word consecutively, or object manipulation again with whole sentence presentation. And we use the sentence types that I've already showed you, so these 11 sentence types, and we divided them up into these different groups. Now, how do you decide that a person has a deficit? Well, a deficit depends upon a difference in performance on an experimental and a baseline sentence. So deficits rely on dissociations. What constitutes a dissociation? How different do performances have to be on these two sentence types for you to say that they dissociate? Well, there's two criteria that seem to me to make sense, and we've explored them both. One is that the patient is above chance on the baseline sentence and at or below chance on the experimental sentence. That corresponds to the intuition that the aphasic patient is not necessarily normal on the experimental sentence, but they master enough of the operations that are necessary to understand it consistently. The baseline sentence, and that they don't master those operations consistently on the experimental sentence. The other possibility is that you insist that the patient be normal on the baseline sentence and accept any level of performance that is below the normal range as poor performance on the experimental sentence. The intuition here is that normal means normal, and that abnormal means not normal, even if it's consistent. A person who's not normal has a deficit. That's the intuition. You also have to, I think, and reviewers of this paper insisted, I think quite correctly, guard against the possibility that your performance on the experimental sentence and your patient's performance on the baseline sentence differ by like one sentence. If you think about what constitutes a chance performance, and you give people 20 sentences in a sentence picture matching two alternative choice tasks, 14 sentences is above chance and 13 is a chance. But are you willing to say that if a person got 13 correct on an object-extracted sentence and 14 correct on a subject-extracted sentence, that they had a deficit in object-extracted sentences? If you want to start basing a theory of the nature of mind on empirical data, that would be a risky thing to do. And so it would be good to insist that the difference between performance on the baseline experimental sentence is also statistically significant by whatever criteria you use. So we applied these criteria. Logically, you could also mix and match these. You could say that good performance is above chance and poor performance is below normal, so that doesn't go anywhere logically, and it doesn't change the data because we've done all of those combinations. And you might want to know how you decide that something is normal. You apply the Crawford criteria for deciding that a patient is normal. Okay, so now how do you go from that to a deficit? Well, a task-independent deficit would show up as a dissociation by one of these two criteria between a baseline and experimental sentence on all tasks. That would be task-independent. A task-dependent deficit would show up as a dissociation in one task but not another, or in two tasks but not the third, and a significant difference in performance on the experimental sentence across tasks, and a significant difference in the difference between baseline and experimental sentence performance across the two tasks. Again, because of this problem of differences being so small that you don't want to hang your hat on them. Okay, a structure-specific deficit would affect all sentence types with an element or a structure, so all the sentences with object extraction, and a construction. I'm going to use the word construction not in the Goldberg sense, but just in the intuitive sense. A construction-specific deficit would affect one sentence type with an element or structure, not others. So what did we find? In these over 100 patients, there are no task-independent deficits by these criteria, not one, for either structures or constructions. And there are a small number of task-dependent deficits, 5 that show up only in one task, and 4 that show up in 2 tasks. And just for no good reason, I'm going to show them to you here. Okay, so I would say there is not a single published case of a patient who has been shown to have a task-independent syntactic comprehension deficit that is specific to a structure or a construction or syntax as a whole. Therefore, I don't think there is any empirical evidence in literature for deficits that affect the parser. Because if a patient can understand and demonstrate understanding of a sentence in one task, unless there's a way to understand it without applying the parser is operational. And deficits are the result of the combination of the application of parsing operations and the use of the product of the parsing interpretive process to accomplish task demands. In order to understand these, we have to have models of how tasks are performed, and not just where the comprehension of a sentence, that is a semantic representation of the sentence, interacts with the performance of the task, but models of how the assignment of that interpretation by the incremental process of parsing interact with that task. Because otherwise, we don't have problems here in matching semantic meanings to a picture or enacting them, because people can enact or match exactly the same semantic meanings when they're presented in the forms of the baseline sentences, like actives versus passives. We don't have such models, therefore we can't have such deficits, and I think this work, I think, really does quite strongly suggest that we should try to think about them. We should be thinking about these models anyway because of the interest in using visual world paradigms as windows into parsing, which require that we understand how the parser interacts incrementally with the inspection and interpretation of visual scenes. And there are people like Shravan Bashist and some of his graduate students and postdocs who are developing such models, but they're very elementary. Okay, so I do have the opportunity here to now turn back to neurological data and look at 2 studies. I already mentioned one, the 2007 study, our 2007 study, that look for deficit lesion correlations as a function of task. Remember, I told you I was going to defer discussion of 2 of these papers till later. That's because they introduced task. So one of them is an acute study, 53 patients, where the size of infarction and hypoperfusion in Broca's area and 12 other Brodmann areas was measured. The authors were some of the few that either read or were influenced by my papers on task effects, and they took seriously the idea that testing patients on one task wasn't good enough. So they used 10 reversible and 10 constrained sentences, active, passive, subject, cleft, and object cleft, 10 of each type. And they considered performance, there to be a syntactic comprehension deficit in a task if performance was at or below chance on passive reversible sentences on at least one task, accuracy on, I think the same for object cleft, and I know the same for object cleft, the slides are wrong. Accuracy on passive sentences was 10% lower than on active sentences, but if you think about it, that means 1 sentence lower.